A newborn entered the world in silence, showing no signs of life, leaving his parents in profound sorrow. But when his older brother gently held him close, an unexpected cry shattered the stillness, leaving the entire hospital in stunned disbelief. Before we dive into this touching story, let us know where you're tuning in from today. Mason had spent months preparing for his new role as a big brother. At just 6 years old, he already envisioned all the things he would teach his baby sibling. How to build forts, play with dinosaurs, and keep secrets only brothers could share. Every night, he would sit beside his mother, Olivia, talking to her belly, whispering promises to the little life growing inside. He swore he would protect him no matter what. His parents, Olivia and Ethan, often exchanged smiles as they watched Mason's excitement. Olivia, now nearing the end of her pregnancy, had spent weeks helping Mason prepare, folding baby clothes together, setting up the nursery, and answering his endless questions about what it meant to be a big brother. One evening, as she sorted tiny socks into neat piles, Mason jumped onto the couch beside her, running his fingers over a soft onesie. "Mom, do you think he'll like dinosaurs?" he asked, his brown eyes filled with curiosity. Olivia chuckled, placing a hand on her belly. "I think he'll love whatever his big brother loves." Mason grinned. "I hope he's as strong as a T-Rex." As if on cue, Olivia gasped softly, her hand flying to her belly. A ripple moved beneath her skin, and Mason's eyes widened in excitement. "Whoa, that was a big kick." He pressed his hands against her belly, waiting. After a moment, another strong nudge met his palm. "He's saying hi to me," he giggled. Ethan walked into the room, loosening his tie. He looked exhausted but smiled at the sight of his wife and son bonding. "Late again," he sighed, leaning down to kiss Olivia's forehead before turning to Mason. "How's my champ?" "Good. And guess what? My brother just kicked me." Mason beamed. Ethan chuckled, ruffling Mason's hair. "That means he's excited to meet you, buddy. Just a few more days now." But as Olivia shifted in her seat, another sharp pain flickered across her face. She quickly masked it with a smile, brushing off Ethan's concerned look. "Just a strong kick," she said, waving him off. Mason watched her closely. Something didn't feel right, though he couldn't explain why. A sudden fall that changed everything. That afternoon, Mason was in his room, stacking blocks into what he proudly called the strongest tower in the world. His fingers moved carefully, balancing each piece, when suddenly a loud crash echoed from the kitchen. His heart skipped a beat. "Mom?" he called out, but silence followed. He abandoned his tower and sprinted toward the sound, dread curling in his stomach. When he reached the kitchen, his breath hitched. Olivia lay sprawled on the cold tile floor, her face pale, beads of sweat glistening on her forehead. Her hand clutched her belly as her breathing grew ragged. "Mom, what's wrong?" His voice trembled as he knelt beside her. Olivia's eyelids fluttered open, and she swallowed hard. "Mason, I feel dizzy. I lost my balance." She tried to push herself up, but a sharp gasp of pain stopped her. Panic gripped Mason as he saw the fear flicker in her eyes. She struggled to steady her breath before looking at him with urgency. "Sweetheart, listen to me. Get my phone. Call an ambulance, now." Mason's fingers trembled as he scrambled to her purse, yanking out her phone. He barely remembered how he pressed the buttons, his voice cracking as he spoke into the receiver. "My mom is sick. She's pregnant and she fell. Please come fast." The dispatcher reassured him that help was on the way, but the seconds stretched into eternity. Mason hovered beside Olivia, his small hands gripping hers. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew something was very wrong. Minutes later, sirens pierced the quiet afternoon, flashing red and blue lights flooding through the windows. Paramedics rushed inside, quickly assessing Olivia, blood pressures dropping. One of them murmured, "She's losing too much blood." Mason barely registered their words. All he saw was his mother's face, her weak smile as she reached for his hand. "You're my brave boy," she whispered, before her eyes fluttered shut. "Mom? Mom?" His voice cracked, but she didn't respond. A paramedic gently pried Mason's fingers from Olivia's and helped him climb into the ambulance. He rode beside her, gripping her hand tightly, refusing to let go. The sirens wailed through the city streets, each blare carving a permanent mark in his memory. A father's impossible choice. At the hospital, Mason sat in the waiting room, his legs swinging anxiously. His heart pounded as he watched the doors his mother had disappeared behind. When Ethan arrived, breathless and frantic, Mason leapt from his seat and ran into his arms. "Dad, Mom's inside. The doctors are helping her." His voice was urgent, desperate for reassurance. Before Ethan could respond, Dr. Smith approached them, her expression grave. "Mr. Ethan, we need to talk immediately." Ethan's body tensed. "What's wrong? Is Olivia okay? What about the baby?" Dr. Smith exhaled, her hands folding in front of her. "Olivia has suffered a severe placental abruption. She's lost a dangerous amount of blood, and the baby is in distress. We need to act now." Mason watched as his father's expression changed. His strong, confident dad suddenly looked lost. "But they'll both be okay, right? There's a way to save them both?" Ethan's voice wavered, though he fought to keep it steady. Dr. Smith hesitated. "We're doing everything we can, but you have to choose, your wife or your child." Ethan's body stiffened. Mason looked up at him, confused. He didn't understand why his dad wasn't answering, why he suddenly looked like he couldn't breathe. "We don't have much time," Dr. Smith added softly. Ethan's gaze darted toward the doors Olivia had disappeared behind, then to the ultrasound photos in his wallet. His mind screamed for both of them. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Save Olivia." The Miracle Newborn. A Brother's Promise Fulfilled Part 2. Ethan felt the weight of his decision crush him as the hospital doors swung shut. He had chosen Olivia. He had spoken the words aloud. But now, as he stood in the sterile hallway, listening to the frantic sounds of doctors working to save his wife and unborn child, a terrible guilt gnawed at him. Mason clung to his father's side, sensing something was terribly wrong. The waiting room felt unbearably cold, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over everything. He didn't understand what the doctor meant, why his dad had to choose. He only knew that his mom had fallen, and now the doctors were trying to help her and his little brother. For what felt like hours, they sat in silence. Mason's legs swung restlessly as he pressed his cheek against his father's arm. He didn't know what to say, and Ethan couldn't find the words to reassure him. Then the door opened, and Dr. Smith walked toward them, her expression unreadable. Ethan shot to his feet. His heart pounded so loudly it drowned out every other sound. "Your wife is stable," Dr. Smith said carefully, but there was hesitation in her voice. "We managed to control the bleeding, but—" She paused, her gaze shifting slightly. Ethan's throat went dry. "The baby." Dr. Smith's eyes softened. "I'm so sorry. He didn't make it." Mason's head snapped up. He blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" Dr. Smith crouched to his level, choosing her words carefully. "Your little brother. He was very sick, sweetheart. He couldn't stay." Mason stepped back, shaking his head. "No, that's not right. He was just kicking me. I promised I'd protect him." Ethan squeezed his son's shoulder, his own grief unbearable. Mason turned to his father, his small hands clutching Ethan's jacket. "Tell her she's wrong, Dad. He's okay, right?" Ethan knelt down, his face twisted in pain. He couldn't lie. His son had to know the truth. "Mason, your little brother went to heaven." The word shattered something inside Mason. His chest heaved, his hands curled into fists. No, I was supposed to keep him safe." His voice cracked with emotion. He turned to Dr. Smith, pleading, "Please, can I see him? I need to see him." Dr. Smith hesitated. Olivia was still unconscious, and Ethan wasn't sure if allowing Mason to see his stillborn brother was the right thing. But Mason was determined. His small body trembled, but his eyes burned with conviction. "Please," he whispered, "I have to say goodbye." After a long pause, Dr. Smith gave a small nod. A brother's final goodbye. The room was eerily quiet as they entered. A nurse stood beside a small bassinet, her face gentle but solemn. In her arms, wrapped in a soft white blanket, was the baby. Mason swallowed hard as he took slow, hesitant steps toward him. His little brother looked peaceful, as if he were simply sleeping. But something felt wrong. The warmth Mason had felt through his mother's belly, the kicks, the excitement, it was gone. "Mom was so excited to meet you," Mason whispered, his voice trembling. "I was too." Ethan knelt beside him, his hand resting on Mason's back. Mason reached out, his small fingers brushing against the baby's cold cheek. A tear slipped down his face as he carefully cradled his brother in his arms. "I told you I'd protect you," he murmured, his voice breaking. "I wasn't supposed to let anything bad happen to you." He rocked his brother gently, offering what little warmth he could. His heart ached with an emotion too big for him to understand. Then the room grew impossibly still. A tiny sound broke through the silence. Mason froze. Another sound, a faint, delicate cry. Ethan's head snapped up. Dr. Smith's eyes went wide. The nurse gasped, nearly dropping her clipboard. Then the sound came again, louder this time. A fragile but unmistakable newborn's cry filled the room. "Oh my God," Dr. Smith breathed, rushing forward, stethoscope already in hand. Mason barely registered the commotion. His wide, tear-filled eyes remained locked on his little brother as he let out another cry, his tiny fists curling against the blanket. "Dad." Mason's voice was barely above a whisper. "He's alive." Ethan staggered back, his hands shaking. "But they said." Dr. Smith was already assessing the infant, her fingers trembling as she pressed the stethoscope against his tiny chest. Seconds later, she let out a stunned breath. "He has a heartbeat, a strong one." The nurse choked back a sob. "This isn't possible. He had no signs of life." Dr. Smith turned to Ethan, her eyes still full of disbelief. I don't know how, but he's alive." Ethan's knees nearly buckled as he clutched the edge of the hospital bed for support. His eyes darted to Mason, who was still holding his brother as though he had willed life back into him. "See?" Mason whispered, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "I told you I would save him." The miracle newborn, a brother's promise fulfilled, Part 3. Dr. Smith's hands shook as she pressed her stethoscope to the baby's chest once more, as if expecting the heartbeat to vanish just as mysteriously as it had appeared. But there it was, steady, strong, and unmistakably real. The newborn's tiny fingers twitched, his chest rising and falling with every delicate breath. The nurse covered her mouth, blinking back tears. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "He had no signs of life. None." Ethan still hadn't moved. His mind refused to process what was happening, what he was seeing with his own eyes. Just moments ago, he had mourned this child. He had been told his son was gone, and now Mason sat there, cradling his baby brother like he had somehow willed him back into existence. Mason, who had promised he would protect him. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat as he crouched down beside his son. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing against the baby's warm, living skin. "How is this happening?" His voice cracked. "How is he breathing?" Dr. Smith exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I don't know. I need to run tests, get him to the NICU. We need to understand how." Before she could finish, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. The door burst open, and a nurse rushed in, her face pale with shock. "Doctor!" His mother, she's awake. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. A mother's unbreakable bond. For hours, Olivia had been slipping in and out of consciousness, her body too weak to fight. The last thing she remembered was Mason's small hand in hers, his voice calling out to her as she was wheeled into surgery. The pain had been unbearable, and then darkness. Now, she blinked against the bright hospital lights, disoriented and confused. Her body ached, but something inside her felt different, like she had been ripped away from something, as if a part of her had been lost. Then she saw the look on the nurse's face. "Where?" "My baby." Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but the urgency was there. The nurse hesitated, eyes darting toward the door. "Your husband is on his way." Olivia tried to sit up, but the IV in her arm tugged painfully, and a deep ache bloomed in her abdomen. She winced but forced herself to speak. "Tell me." The nurse's lips parted, but before she could respond, the door swung open again. Ethan stood there, breathless, his eyes wide. In his arms, wrapped in the same white hospital blanket, was their baby. But he wasn't lifeless. He wasn't cold. He was alive. Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes as Ethan took careful steps toward her, his face a mixture of shock and overwhelming emotion. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, only stare at the tiny, breathing miracle in his arms. "He's alive," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. "Olivia. He's alive." A sob tore through her throat as she reached out with trembling hands. "Give him to me." Ethan carefully lowered their son into her arms. The moment his tiny body settled against her chest, Olivia felt something deep inside her snap back into place. She inhaled sharply, feeling his warmth, his fragile heartbeat against her skin. "How?" she choked out. "Mason." Ethan murmured. At the sound of his name, Olivia's eyes flicked toward the door where their eldest son stood, watching them. His small face was streaked with dried tears, but there was something else in his expression, something far beyond his 6 years. Mason stepped forward, hesitant at first, then braver as he climbed onto the hospital bed beside his mother. His hands were still trembling as he reached out and gently stroked his baby brother's tiny fingers. "I told you I'd protect him," Mason said quietly. Tears streamed down Olivia's face as she kissed the top of Mason's head. "You did, sweetheart, you did." The medical mystery. The hospital was in an uproar. Doctors and nurses flooded the room, whispering, exchanging disbelieving glances as Dr. Smith ran test after test. They checked oxygen levels, heart rate, brain function, every vital sign they could measure. Everything was normal. No abnormalities. No signs of distress. No explanation for what had happened. "There is no medical reasoning for this," Dr. Smith finally admitted, pinching the bridge of her nose. He was gone. "I signed the certificate myself." She turned to Olivia and Ethan, eyes still wide with disbelief. "We don't see recoveries like this, ever." Ethan held Olivia's hand tightly, still trying to process it all himself. Olivia cradled her newborn protectively, refusing to let anyone take him from her arms for even a moment. Mason sat beside her, still staring at his little brother with something close to awe. He wasn't a doctor. He didn't understand why grown-ups needed so many explanations. He only knew what he felt, what he had felt all along. "It's because I kept my promise," he said simply, his small voice cutting through the quiet room. Dr. Smith looked at him curiously. "What do you mean, Mason?" Mason traced his fingers gently along his baby brother's tiny hand. "I told him I'd protect him," he said. "I told him not to be scared, that I'd always be there." He looked up, his young eyes filled with certainty. "And I was." The room fell silent. No one had an answer. Because some things, even in the world of science, could not be explained. Final reflection. The hospital soon called it a medical anomaly, but those who witnessed it knew better. Some called it fate. Some called it divine intervention. But Olivia and Ethan? They believed in something far more powerful. They believed in the love of a big brother. Mason had made a promise, and somehow, in a way that no doctor could ever explain, he had kept it. As they finally brought their miracle baby home, Mason sat beside the crib, watching over his little brother as he slept. He smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from the infant's forehead. "I told you I'd protect you," he whispered. And he always would. Life is full of moments that challenge our beliefs, yet sometimes, the unexplainable reminds us of the power of love, faith, and determination. What do you think truly happened in that hospital room? Was it science, a miracle, or something beyond our understanding? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for